AI for park ranger lived alone for 10 years until a Sasquatch family arrived. Bigfoot sighting. For a decade, one ranger lived alone on a mountain fire lookout cut off from the world. Surrounded by endless forest and silence, his only company was the weather, the wildlife, and the radio crackle of distant voices. But in his 7th year, everything changed. Tracks too large for any boot appeared in the thawing mud. Tree trunks were stripped and stacked like markers, and on stormy nights something circled his cabin, breathing heavy just beyond the thin wooden walls. He thought solitude was the hardest part. He thought the danger came from snow, storms, or bears. He was wrong. Something else had moved in a family watching him, closer every night. What happens when 10 years of isolation turns into 10 years of being studied? And what if they were never just passing through, but waiting for him all along? Let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. If you like stories that connect us, don't forget to subscribe before you leave. Spent the better part of a decade watching over these mountains from Fire Lookout Station 307. The locals just call it Angel Peak Station, though. There's nothing particularly angelic about this remote outpost, perched at 7,000 feet in the North Cascades. It's just me, my equipment, and 360 degrees of wilderness stretching as far as the eye can see. The lookout itself is a 14 by 14 foot cabin mounted on steel stilts, with windows on all sides giving me an unobstructed view of the surrounding territory. It's Spartan but functional, a small bed, a wood stove, my monitoring equipment, and enough shelf space for several months' worth of supplies. The Forest Service installed solar panels 5 years ago, so I at least have reliable power for my radio and weather instruments. My daily routine hasn't changed much since I first took this post. I wake before sunrise to begin my morning weather observations. Temperature, wind speed and direction, cloud cover, precipitation, all carefully logged and radioed down to district headquarters. Then I spend the daylight hours scanning the horizon, with binoculars, watching for the telltale wisps of smoke that could signal the start of a wildfire. During fire season, this vigilance becomes even more critical between weather reports and fire watches. I maintain the station's equipment, check the solar system, and keep detailed logs of everything I observe. The radio crackles to life twice daily for scheduled check-ins. But otherwise, human contact is limited to monthly supply flights during the good weather months. In winter, those flights become less predictable, sometimes leaving me completely isolated for weeks at a time when storms roll in. The isolation doesn't bother me the way it might others. I've always preferred the quiet company of mountains to the chaos of cities. Up here, time moves differently. You start to notice subtle changes in the landscape, the way shadows creep across valleys, how the wind's voice changes before a storm, the gradual shift of seasons marked by the movement of wildlife below. My lookout sits at the convergence of 3 major watersheds. To the north, old-growth forest blankets the slopes, some trees older than the United States itself. The eastern ridge drops away into a series of steep canyons, while the western approach offers the only relatively gentle grade, though gentle is a relative term at this elevation. South of the station, the terrain becomes increasingly rugged, with deep valleys and unnamed peaks stretching toward the horizon. The job requires absolute attention to detail and unwavering adherence to protocol. Every observation, every radio call, every maintenance task must be performed precisely and logged accurately. This discipline isn't just bureaucratic busy work in an environment. This remote, small mistakes can have serious consequences. My field journals contain 10 years of meticulous notes on weather patterns, wildlife movements, and terrain conditions. This information isn't just for fire prevention. It's a running record of the mountain's moods and rhythms. Most people would probably find the repetition monotonous, but I've come to appreciate how these routines anchor me to reality. When you're alone on a mountain for months at a time, it's easy to lose track of days or let your mind wander down strange paths. The strict schedule keeps me focused, professional. Every morning at OSX 100 hours, I key the radio, Angel Peak Station with morning weather report. Every evening, at 2000 hours, I log the day's final observations. Between those bookends, I maintain my watch over this vast wilderness. I've seen things from this perch that most people never will. Golden eagles riding thermals at eye level. Mountain goats navigating seemingly impossible cliff faces, northern lights dancing across winter skies so clear you'd swear you could touch them. But I've also witnessed the raw power of nature, lightning strikes that split ancient trees like matchsticks, avalanches that reshape entire slopes in minutes, and storms that make this steel-reinforced cabin shudder like it's made of paper. The Forest Service manual calls this position Fire Lookout, GSO 46205, but that clinical title doesn't capture the essence of what we do up here. We're the eyes on the wilderness, the first line of defense against disasters that could destroy thousands of acres of pristine forest. More than that, we're the keepers of a tradition that stretches back to the early days of conservation, when these towers first began dotting the high country. This may be one of the last places in the lower 48 states where you can stand at your post and not see a single sign of human development in any direction. No roads, no power lines, no contrails in the sky, just mile after mile of untamed landscape that looks much the same as it did centuries ago. It's a reminder that despite all our technology and progress, there are still places where nature holds undisputed dominion. I've spent the better part of a decade watching over these mountains from Fire Lookout Station 30. The locals just call it Angel Peak Station, though there's nothing particularly angelic about this remote outpost perched at 7,000 feet in the North Cascades. It's just me, the endless stretch of wilderness, and the kind of silence that becomes a living thing after a while. Those first winters were the hardest. November through March, I'm effectively cut off from the world below. The access road disappears under 15 feet of snow, and my little glass house in the sky becomes both sanctuary and prison. The Park Service trained us for the isolation, of course. They drill protocols into you, twice daily radio checks, with headquarters, detailed weather logging, equipment, maintenance schedules. Structure becomes your lifeline when the world shrinks to 400 square feet. The radio crackles to life at 800 and 1600 hours, like clockwork. Angel Peak, this is district base, radio check. Over some days, those brief exchanges with dispatch are my only human contact. I've learned to savor them, even if it's just coordinates and wind speeds. Sarah, our morning dispatcher, always tries to slip in a quick "how are you holding up?" before signing off. It's against protocol, technically, but management looks the other way. They understand what this kind of solitude does to a person. Supply flights come once a month during the fair weather season, weather permitting. The sound of those bushplane engines is sweeter than any symphony. Fresh food, mail, maybe a new book if I'm lucky. Pete, our regular pilot, knows to circle the tower twice before landing. It's our little ritual, his way of saying civilization still exists out there. Sometimes he stays for coffee, shares news from below. Those visits are gold, but they're also dangerous. They remind you of everything you're missing. The hikers are seasonal visitors, mainly during the brief summer window when the trails are passable. They arrive wide-eyed at my door, amazed to find someone actually living up here. I've gotten good at the tour guide spiel, pointing out the peaks, explaining how we spot fires, showing off the Osborne firefinder that's been here since 1943. Their presence is both welcome and exhausting. After they leave, the silence feels heavier somehow. My journal became my closest companion early on. The Park Service requires basic logging, weather conditions, visibility, maintenance, notes. But between those official entries, personal observations started creeping in. The way moonlight plays on fresh snow, the migration patterns of mountain goats, the strange way sound carries up here, how you can sometimes hear conversations from trails that look impossibly distant through binoculars. I started sketching to cloud formations at first, then the changing light on familiar peaks, the tracks I'd find around the station after storms. There's something meditative about putting pencil to paper, trying to capture the subtle shifts in this seemingly unchanging landscape. The journal pages filled up with more than just data. They became a record of my slow transformation from visitor to permanent resident of this high, lonely world. The isolation changes you in ways that are hard to explain to outsiders. You develop a different relationship with time up here. Days blur together, marked more by weather patterns than calendar dates. The mountains become characters you know intimately, their moods, their voices, their secrets. You learn to read the sky like a book, to smell snow coming days before it arrives, to distinguish between 15 different kinds of silence. That silence, it's probably the hardest thing for most people to grasp. It's not just the absence of human noise. It's a presence, ancient and absolute. During winter storms, when the wind howls for days and visibility drops to zero, you almost miss it. But when the weather clears and that deep quiet returns, it settles into your bones. You either make peace with it or you break. I've seen good rangers leave after one season, unable to bear the weight of all that nothing. I learned to talk to myself, not in the frantic way of someone losing grip, but as a practical matter of maintenance. Sometimes I read my log entries aloud or narrate what I'm doing during equipment checks. It's not about filling the silence. You never really can, but about remembering the sound of human speech, keeping those pathways open. The Park Service psychologist who evaluates us annually says this is healthy, normal even. She calls it adaptive isolation behavior. I call it survival. My little glass house has become more than just a posting. It's home in a way no place below ever was. I know every creak of its metal frame, every scratch on its windows, every quirk of its ancient heating system. During clear nights, when the stars feel close enough to touch and the air is sharp enough to cut, I understand why I stayed when so many others left. This isn't just a job anymore. It's a calling, a commitment to watching over this small piece of wilderness that most people will never see. Those first winters were the hardest. November through March, I'm effectively cut off from the world below. The access road disappears under 15 feet of snow, and my little glass house in the sky becomes both sanctuary and prison. The Park Service trained us for the isolation, of course. They drill protocols into you, twice daily radio checks, with headquarters, detailed weather logging, equipment, maintenance schedules. But no amount of training truly prepares you for the weight of that silence. my journal became my closest companion, its pages filled with observations that went far beyond the required documentation. Every morning, I'd record the temperature, wind speed, and precipitation. But between those official entries, I began cataloging the subtle rhythms of the wilderness that surrounded me. You see, a ranger's training emphasizes the importance of reading the landscape. We learn to distinguish between different animal tracks, to identify the varied calls of birds, to recognize the subtle signs that tell stories about what happened in the night. Over the years, I've developed an intimate knowledge of the wildlife that calls these mountains home. The elk herds move through the valleys below like living rivers, their patterns as predictable as the seasons. In early spring, I watch them through my binoculars as they emerge from the tree line at dawn, mothers shepherding their calves through patches of fresh grass. Their bugling echoes off the mountainsides during rutting season, a sound that carries. For miles in the clear mountain air, black bears leave their own distinct signatures on the landscape. I've learned to spot their claw marks on trees, the overturned rocks where they've searched for grubs, the flattened circles of grass where they've bedded down. During my supply runs to the lower elevations, I've encountered them often enough to respect their space without fear. They have their routines, their territories, and they generally want nothing to do with humans. The mountain lions are different. In all my years up here, I've only seen 3 in the flesh, but I know they're always around. They're ghosts in the landscape, leaving only the faintest traces of their passage. A half-buried scat here, a scratched tree there. Their screams in the night are unmistakable, though rare. When tracking their movements, every detail matters. The spacing of their prints, the depth of their impressions, the direction of their travel. It all tells a story. My training taught me to document everything with scientific precision. A track isn't just a track. It's a measurement, a direction, a time stamp in the snow or mud. Weather conditions affect how prints age, how scents carry, how sounds travel through the valleys. Understanding these variables isn't just academic, it's essential for search and rescue operations, wildlife management, and my own survival up here. I've filled dozens of journals with these observations, detailed sketches of tracks, noting their exact dimensions, times and locations of animal cores, mapped against weather conditions, behavior patterns during different seasons, moon phases, and weather events. This methodical documentation has become second nature, a way of maintaining order in this vast wilderness. The radio calls with headquarters punctuate my days, breaking up the solitude with brief exchanges about weather conditions and potential fire risks. But it's my journal entries that truly capture the essence of this place. Between the official logs, I write about the way moonlight creates shadows on fresh snow, how the wind changes its voice depending on the season, the precise shade of green that signals spring's first thrust through winter's grip. This attention to detail isn't just professional thoroughness, it's survival. When you're alone at 7,000 feet, with the nearest help hours away in good conditions, you need to read the environment accurately. A misidentified track, a misinterpreted sign, or an ignored weather pattern could have serious consequences. That's why we're trained to trust our observations, but verify them meticulously. To question what we see until we're certain. Each animal has its own signature in the landscape, its own way of moving through the world. After years of observation, these patterns become as familiar as written words. When something deviates from these established patterns, it stands out immediately. Nature speaks its own language up here, and I've learned to be fluent in its dialects. My journals document this fluency, page after page of observations, measurements, and patterns. They're more than just records. They're a testament to the predictable rhythms of this wilderness, a baseline against which any anomaly would be immediately apparent. This is how we're trained, to observe, document, and understand. Because, in this environment, knowledge isn't just power, it's survival. It was in my 7th year, at the lookout, when I first noticed the changes. They were subtle at first, the kind of things that could be easily dismissed if you weren't paying attention. But after so many seasons of watching these mountains, even the smallest disruption to their rhythms stood out, like a discordant note in a familiar song. The first thing I noticed was the birds, or rather, their absence. The Western Valley had always been a reliable spot for Clark's nutcrackers. Every morning, I'd watch them through my binoculars, swooping between the tall pines, their distinctive calls carrying clearly across the distance. But sometime in early June, they just stopped. The valley didn't go silent. There were still ravens and the occasional eagle, but the nutcrackers had abandoned their usual territory. I documented it in my journal, cross-referencing weather patterns and seasonal changes, looking for any environmental factor that might explain their departure. Nothing added up. The temperature was normal for that time of year, precipitation levels were consistent with historical data, and there were no obvious disturbances to their food sources. Then came the smell. I've logged thousands of miles on these trails over the years, and every section has its own olfactory signature: the sharp pine needles, the sweet decay of forest floor, the mineral temps of snowmelt. But during my routine patrol of the eastern ridge in late June, I encountered something different. It was a musky animal odor, reminiscent of wet fur, but more intense, more primitive, somehow. The first time I noticed it, I marked it down as a possible bear den nearby, but the smell kept appearing in different locations, always strong enough to notice, but never leading to any clear source. It would linger in places I'd walked hundreds of times before, places where I'd never detected it in all my previous years. What made it stranger was how the smell seemed to defy normal patterns of dispersion. Anyone who's spent time tracking wildlife knows how scents behave in mountain air, how they follow thermal currents, how they're affected by humidity and wind direction. But this odor appeared and disappeared in ways that didn't match my experience or training. I began mapping the locations where I encountered the smell, creating a detailed grid in my journal. The pattern that emerged was irregular, but it seemed to follow a rough, circular path around several valleys, always staying between 4,000 and 6,000 feet in elevation. It was the kind of detail that would sound obsessive to an outsider, but any ranger worth their salt knows that patterns matter. The wildlife changes became more pronounced as summer progressed. Elk herds modified their grazing patterns, avoiding meadows they'd used for generations. I'd find areas where they'd clearly started to feed, only to abandon the spot abruptly, leaving half-eaten vegetation behind. This wasn't normal predator response behavior. I'd seen how they react to wolves and mountain lions. This was different. During my radio check-ins with headquarters, I kept these observations to myself. How do you report something when you're not even sure what you're reporting? The birds are gone and there's a weird smell isn't exactly the kind of information that gets taken seriously. Besides, I had no concrete evidence that anything was actually wrong, just a growing collection of small anomalies that kept nudging at my professional instincts. By August, I had filled nearly 30 pages in my journal with these irregular patterns. the missing birds, the unexplained odor, the altered wildlife behavior. Each incident on its own could be rationalized away, but together they formed a picture I couldn't quite bring into focus. It was like trying to assemble a puzzle while missing crucial pieces. I've always prided myself on maintaining scientific objectivity in my observations. 7 years of methodical documentation had taught me to trust the evidence, not my imagination. But for the first time since taking this post, I found myself second-guessing my own senses. The familiar landscape I'd come to know so intimately felt subtly altered, as if something had shifted just beneath its surface. The changes were gradual enough that someone passing through might never notice them. But up here, where watching and recording the wilderness is quite literally my job, they stood out like fingerprints on a clean window. Something had disturbed the delicate balance of these mountains, and all my training and experience couldn't explain what it was. It was April 15th when I found the track. The morning had started like any other, my usual rounds checking weather instruments and scanning the horizons for smoke. Spring thaw was well underway, turning the mountainside into a patchwork of melting snow and exposed earth. The mud near the lookout's base was soft, recording every passing creature with perfect clarity. I had just finished my morning radio check with headquarters when I noticed something odd about the ground near the east-facing steps. At first, I thought someone had visited during the night, though that would have been unusual enough to warrant concern. We rarely got hikers this early in the season, and protocol required all visitors to check in. What I found stopped me cold. There, pressed deep into the dark soil, was a single footprint unlike anything I'd seen in my 23 years of wilderness work. 5 distinct toes, each one clearly defined, spread wider than my outstretched hand. The impression was fresh, the edges still sharp in the morning light. This was no bare track. I'd documented hundreds of those. No, this print showed a distinctly human-like foot structure, but at a scale that made no sense. My training kicked in before my imagination could run wild. I pulled out my camera and ruler from my gear bag, placing the measuring tool carefully alongside the impression. 16 inches from heel to toe. The width at the ball of the foot measured 7.5 inches. The depth of the impression suggested whatever made it carried substantial weight. I took multiple photos from different angles, making sure to capture how the morning light cast shadows across each detail. Then I did something I hadn't done since my early days of tracking courses. I pulled out my field journal and made a careful sketch. Every toe, every contour, every detail that might matter later. As I worked, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. For the first time in all my years of solitude, I felt watched. The feeling was so sudden and intense that I caught myself glancing over my shoulder at the tree line. Nothing moved except branches in the light breeze, but something had changed. The comfortable isolation I'd known for 7 years felt different now. I made a plaster cast of the print, standard procedure for unusual tracks. While waiting for it to set, I radioed headquarters, keeping my voice steady as I reported finding unusual wildlife sign that required documentation. I didn't mention my private suspicions, after so many years of being the voice of reason, of explaining away hikers' strange stories with practical facts about known animals. I couldn't bring myself to suggest what this might be. The cast took 30 minutes to dry completely. When I finally lifted it from the ground, the detail was perfect, every ridge and curve preserved in stark white plaster. I photographed the cast as well, then carefully wrapped it in my spare shirt and stored it in my pack. By then, the sun had climbed higher, and the original track was beginning to lose definition as the mud dried dot back in the lookout tower. I spent an hour comparing my photos and sketches to every tracking guide I had. Nothing matched. Bear prints. Have 5 toes, but their shape and spacing are entirely different. Human feet don't come close to these dimensions. I found myself returning to stories I'd dismissed over the years, tales from hikers about strange sounds in the night, about feeling watched, about massive shadows moving through dense forest. I made detailed notes in my official log, sticking to objective measurements and observations. But in my personal journal, I wrote what I couldn't put in the official record. Something intelligent made this track. Something that walks upright. Something that chose to approach within 50 feet of my lookout while I slept that night. For the first time since my first year at the station, I double-checked the locks on my door and windows. The familiar creaks and groans of the lookout tower in the wind took on new meaning. Every sound from the darkness below seemed to carry purpose. I kept the plaster cast on my desk, its white surface catching moonlight through the windows. As I lay in my bunk, I couldn't shake the feeling that by documenting this track, by acknowledging its existence, I had crossed some invisible line. The wilderness I thought I knew so well suddenly felt larger, older, and far less empty than before. The weeks following my discovery of that unsettling footprint passed with agonizing slowness. I found myself checking and rechecking the photographs I'd taken, comparing measurements against known wildlife prints in my field guides. Nothing matched. The impression had measured 15 3/4 inches from heel to toe, with 5 distinct digit marks splayed wider than any human foot I'd ever encountered. But it was the knocking that truly began to erode my professional detachment. I first heard it on April 29th, just as the sun was settling behind the western ridgeline. 3 sharp reports, like someone striking a hollow tree with a baseball bat. The sound carried clearly across the valley, originating from the timbered slope about half a mile east of my position. My initial thought was woodpeckers. We get northern flickers and pileated woodpeckers up here regularly, but the spacing between the knocks was too precise, too measured. I made a note in my log and tried to dismiss it. 2 nights later, it happened again. Same time, same direction, same pattern. 3 distinct knocks. Only this time, something answered from the northern ridge. 2 knocks, slightly deeper in tone. Then silence. I found myself standing at my observation window, binoculars pressed against the glass, though the gathering darkness revealed nothing but black tree shapes against a darker sky. The exchange repeated twice more that evening, and I carefully recorded the times and directions in my journal. Probably hunters, I told myself, though I knew hunting season was months away. Or maybe geological settling, temperature changes, can make rocks crack. But these rationalizations felt hollow, especially after what I'd seen with that track. Over the next 3 weeks, the knocking became almost routine. Always starting around dusk. Always that same calandra response pattern. I began plotting the locations on my topographical maps, noting how the sounds seemed to move in a rough circle around my lookout tower. Some nights, I'd hear them from 3 different positions, creating a triangle of sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. I'm trained to recognize wildlife behavior patterns. Every animal in these mountains has its own schedule, its own territory, its own way of communicating. But this was different. The precision of it, the way it seemed to follow rules, the fact that it only happened at dusk, never during daylight hours or deep night. On May 23rd, I broke protocol and recorded the sounds on my personal phone. I needed something concrete, something I could play back to convince myself I wasn't imagining things. The recording captured it perfectly, that hollow wooden report echoing across the valley. When I played it back the next evening, standing on my observation deck, something immediately answered from the tree line below. 3 quick knocks, urgent and closer than ever before. I deleted the recording that same night. My radio calls to headquarters became shorter, more perfunctory. How could I explain what was happening? That something was out there, apparently coordinating positions using coded knocks. That these sounds seemed to be closing in on my position with each passing week. I'd be pulled from my post for a psychological evaluation before I could finish the report. Instead, I filled page after page in my journal, documenting times, directions, patterns. I drew diagrams showing how the knocking positions shifted night to night. I noted weather conditions, moon phases, anything that might reveal some natural explanation for what I was experiencing. The solitude, which had once been a comfort, began to feel like a weight. During the day, I caught myself scanning the tree line through my binoculars, looking for movement, for shadows that didn't belong. At night, I left my lights off and sat in darkness, listening. The knocking continued its nightly performance, but now it felt personal, like something testing my responses, gauging my awareness. By early June, I could predict almost to the minute when the first knocks would sound. 3 sharp reports from the east, followed by 2 from the north. Sometimes a third position would join in from the south, creating a conversation I couldn't understand but couldn't ignore. The precision and regularity of it all suggested purpose, intelligence. These weren't random, natural sounds. They were signals. But signals from what? To what end? Those questions kept me awake long after the knocking fell silent each night, staring at my ceiling as clouds drifted past the moon, casting strange shadows through my windows. The footprint had been unsettling enough, but this felt like communication, like something out there was trying to make its presence known. One calculated knock at a time. The morning of June 12th started like any other. I had a routine, surveyed a complete of the northwestern quadrant, checking for any signs of fire hazards or disturbances. The weather was clear, temperature hovering around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze from the southwest. Perfect conditions for a 4-hour hike through my sector. I followed my usual route along the ridge, making notes about vegetation conditions and checking the emergency supply caches we maintain for lost hikers. Everything was normal until I reached Marker 7, where an old game trail crosses the main path. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain tried to process it as storm damage, but something wasn't right. 8 tree trunks, each roughly 12 feet in length, had been laid parallel to each other across the game trail. They were stripped completely of bark, bleached pale by exposure, but it wasn't their appearance that stopped me cold. It was their arrangement. These weren't trees that had fallen naturally. Each trunk was positioned exactly 3 feet apart, creating a deliberate line that stretched for about 30 feet across the trail. The spacing was too precise, too intentional. I've seen plenty of deadfall in my years up here, and nature doesn't work with such geometric precision. I approached carefully, my ranger training kicking in. The first thing I noticed was the size of these trunks. Each one would have weighed several hundred pounds at least. No human could have moved them alone, and there had been no logging operations in this area for decades. The ends showed no sign of saw marks or tool use. Kneeling beside the nearest trunk, I examined the stripped surface. The bark hadn't been removed with any tool I recognized. There were no characteristic marks from axes or debarking spuds. Instead, the wood appeared to have been peeled, almost like someone had pulled the bark off in long strips, using immense strength. I took out my notebook and began documenting everything: measurements, compass, orientation, spacing between trunks. I photographed the scene from multiple angles, including close-ups of the stripped surfaces. My hand was shaking slightly as I made my sketches, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what I was seeing. How would this sound in my official report? 8 massive trees, deliberately arranged with mathematical precision, stripped by unknown means. I could already imagine the reactions from headquarters. They'd assumed it was some kind of art installation or elaborate prank, but I knew better. The sheer weight of these trunks made human involvement nearly impossible without heavy machinery, and there were no track marks. No disturbed earth, no sign of equipment having been used. I spent 45 minutes documenting everything I could before continuing my survey. In my logbook, I wrote only the facts, keeping my speculations to myself. But I knew I'd be returning to this spot. And soon, the storm hit just after midnight, rattling the windows of my lookout tower with increasing fury. I had been dozing in my bunk, the weather radio crackling with updates about the system moving. Through the Cascades, the wind howled around the tower's steel frame, a sound I'd grown accustomed to over my years of service. But at 2:15 in the morning, another sound cut through the storm's chaos, deliberate, heavy footsteps on the ground below. At first, I tried to rationalize it as debris being thrown against the tower's base. Then the pattern became unmistakable. Step, pause, step, pause. Whatever was down there was massive, its weight causing the frozen ground to crunch audibly even. Through the wind, I lay perfectly still in my bunk, barely breathing, as the footfalls began a methodical circuit around the tower. They would stop near each window, lingering there for several long seconds before moving on. The glass panes were frosted with ice, making it impossible to see anything in the darkness beyond. This continued for what felt like hours. This slow, purposeful pacing punctuated by pauses at each window. I could hear deep breathing during these stops, like steam engine exhaust in the cold. My hand crept toward the satellite phone on my bedside table, but I couldn't bring myself to move enough to reach it. Some primal instinct told me absolute stillness was my best defense. The circuit repeated 3 more times before the footsteps finally retreated into the timber. Even then, I remained frozen in place, listening intently until the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the frosted windows. Only when full daylight arrived did I finally venture outside. 6 inches of fresh snow had fallen during the night, but there they were, massive impressions leading away from the tower. They were already beginning to lose definition in the morning sun, but their size was unmistakable. My boot could have fit twice inside each one. I followed them to the tree line with my camera, taking what photos I could before the warming day destroyed the evidence. The tracks led straight into the densest part of the forest before disappearing into the shadows beneath the evergreens. During my scheduled radio check-in at 0800 hours, I hesitated before mentioning the night's events to my supervisor. The words felt strange in my mouth, clinical descriptions failing to capture the unnatural quality of what I'd experienced. Possible large predator activity around the station during the storm, I reported, keeping my tone professional. Multiple tracks observed. Unusual movement pattern. There was a pause on the other end before my supervisor responded. Bears getting active this time of year, he said, his voice carrying that carefully neutral tone I recognized from dealing with hikers, reporting mountain lions in impossible places. They'll sometimes seek shelter near structures during severe weather. Sir, the tracks and behavior pattern don't match any bear activity I've documented in my 10 years here, I said, aware of how this might sound. The movement was deliberate, methodical, almost I stopped myself before saying, intelligent. Listen, John, he said, using my first name, never a good sign. Extended isolation can play tricks on the mind. Maybe take some leave when the weather clears. Get down to town for a few days. Before I could respond, he informed me that Sir Jandrescu would be doing welfare checks after the storm. Standard procedure, he emphasized, not because of my report. The deputies arrived around noon in their snow machines. The younger one, Thompson, joked about cabin fever season while his partner, Martinez, examined the remaining impressions in the snow with quiet intensity. I watched as she took measurements and photos, her expression unreadable. Tracks had degraded, Martinez noted officially, consistent with large wildlife, but environmental conditions make positive identification impossible. She paused, glancing at the tree line. We'll mark it as inconclusive in the report. Something in her tone suggested she was choosing her words carefully. Our eyes met briefly, and I recognized the look of someone deciding not to voice their full thoughts. In that moment, I felt an odd mixture of frustration and relief, frustrated at being diplomatically dismissed, yet grateful that I wouldn't have to defend what I knew I'd experienced. The season shifted, and with summer's return came a new phase in my vigil. The first sighting occurred in early June, just as dawn was breaking over the eastern ridges. Through my binoculars, I caught movement at the tree line, a massive silhouette, easily 8 feet tall, broader than any bear I'd ever documented. But the moment I tried to focus directly on it, it melted into the shadows of the forest with surprising grace for its size. These glimpses became more frequent as the days lengthened. Sometimes at dusk, sometimes in the hazy morning light, always at the edge of where forest met clearing. I began keeping a detailed log of each sighting, noting time, weather conditions, and location. What struck me most was the deliberate way these figures moved, not the random wandering of wildlife, but purposeful observation. The incidents with my equipment started small. One morning, I found my weather gauges carefully repositioned, not damaged, just studied. My trail cameras would be turned slightly, facing new angles. A stack of firewood I'd left by the tower's base would be methodically reorganized, the logs arranged by size. Nothing ever disappeared. This wasn't theft or vandalism. It felt more like examination, testing, learning, but it was the pattern of movement that finally confirmed my growing suspicion. Through careful observation, I began noticing not just one set of tracks or one silhouette, but multiple signs of passage, different sizes, different gaits, moving in coordinated patterns. I'd catch glimpses of smaller figures trailing larger ones, or spot parallel tracks suggesting group movement through the underbrush. These weren't the random encounters with a solitary creature. I was witnessing what appeared to be a family unit, maintaining a calculated distance while gradually expanding their circle of interaction around my tower. They seemed to be studying me as much as I was studying them, testing boundaries, establishing some form of cautious coexistence. In my official logs, I kept the entries brief and factual. But in my personal journal, I documented every detail of what I was beginning to understand was a complex social group. moving with intelligence and purpose through their territory that I was increasingly aware I had been permitted to share. As July stretched into August, I made a decision that I knew might be unwise, but my curiosity overwhelmed my caution. I began leaving small offerings at the tree line, nothing elaborate, just simple foods. The first night, I placed a few apples and some dried beef jerky on a flat rock about 150 yards from the tower. By morning, the food was gone, but what struck me was the careful way it had been taken. The rock wasn't disturbed, and there were no scattered remains or torn packaging as you might expect from bears or other wildlife. It was as if someone had deliberately collected each item, leaving the site almost untouched. This became a nightly ritual. I would leave different foods, nuts, dried fruits, more jerky, and each morning I'd find everything gone. The sites always left remarkably clean. The nighttime disturbances around the tower decreased noticeably. No more heavy footsteps circling the building, no more rearranged tools. It was as if we'd reached some unspoken arrangement. But this new peace brought its own kind of unease. Was I creating a dangerous dependency? These beings, whatever they were, had clearly survived. In these mountains long before my arrival, I worried I might be altering natural behaviors, or worse, establishing expectations that could lead to problems for whoever might replace me at this post. The feeling of being watched intensified, becoming more personal somehow. During my daily rounds, I'd catch glimpses of movement much closer than before, sometimes just 75 or 80 yards away, instead of the usual 200. The figures seemed more willing to linger before disappearing, as if acknowledging our tentative connection. One morning, I found something unexpected at the feeding site. A freshly killed rabbit laid carefully on the same rock where I left my offerings. It wasn't torn or mangled, just cleanly dispatched. The gesture felt significant, though I couldn't quite interpret its meaning. Was it a reciprocal offering, a demonstration of hunting skill, or perhaps a way of showing they didn't need my food to survive? The complexity of the situation weighed on me each night as I placed the food. I questioned whether I was engaging in a fair exchange or unwittingly creating a problematic dynamic. The sense of being observed had evolved from unsettling to oddly familiar. Yet that familiarity itself was unsettling in a different way. It happened on my third night of leaving food. The temperature had dropped to 42 degrees, and a thin fog had settled around the tower. I was at my desk, updating the day's weather logs, when I heard it. Voices, but not human voices. The first sound was deep, a rumbling tone that seemed to vibrate through the station's wooden walls. It lasted perhaps 3 or 4 seconds before being answered by a higher pitch, almost musical in comparison. They alternated, these two distinct vocalizations, with pauses between them that felt deliberate, structured, like a conversation. I sat completely still, pen frozen mid-word on the page. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. The exchange continued for what must have been 2 or 3 minutes, though it felt much longer. The voices never raised in volume or showed signs of agitation. They maintained that same measured, almost contemplative pace. My training told me to investigate, to document, to at least look out the window, but something more primitive kept me rooted to my chair. Not exactly fear, though that was certainly present, but a deep, instinctive understanding that I was witnessing something I wasn't meant to see, or, in this case, hear. The vocalizations gradually moved around the clearing, never coming closer to the tower, but never retreating into the forest either. Eventually, they faded into silence, though I remained awake until the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. When morning finally came, I forced myself to conduct a perimeter check. The fog had lifted, revealing a ring of broken branches around the clearing, not snapped by wind or weather, but deliberately broken at chest height, all facing inward toward the tower. Some were as thick as my wrist, requiring considerable strength to break. The pattern extended in a near-perfect circle, about 100 feet out from the station. Whatever had visited during the night hadn't just passed through, it had lingered, marking its presence in a way I couldn't ignore. The precision of the broken branches suggested purpose, perhaps even meaning. But what that meaning might be, I couldn't begin to guess. The distant thrum of helicopter blades broke through my morning routine 3 days later. I'd been expecting the monthly resupply flight, but the sound still startled me after weeks of isolation. As the helicopter touched down in the small clearing, I watched Pete, the usual pilot, emerge with several supply crates. "How's the hermit life treating you?" he called out over the dying rotors, flashing his characteristic grin. The sight of another human being stirred conflicting emotions, relief at the connection, yet anxiety about the weight of what I'd been keeping to myself while we unloaded supplies. Pete chatted about developments in the outside world, park, policy changes, staff rotations, a new superintendent. I nodded and responded appropriately, but my mind kept drifting to the leather-bound journals stacked on my desk inside. They contained every detail: the tracks, the knocks, the arranged pine cones, those unsettling vocalizations, pages of sketches, and observations that would sound impossible to anyone who hadn't experienced them. Several times during the resupply, I nearly mentioned something. The words hovered on the tip of my tongue as we shared coffee from my thermos, but each time I started to speak, I imagined the skepticism that would cross Pete's face, the polite disbelief, the concerned glances, the inevitable suggestions about the psychological effects of prolonged isolation. "You seem quieter than usual," Pete remarked as he prepared for departure. "Everything okay up here?" I forced a smile. "Just the usual. You know how it gets." He nodded, though I caught the slight furrow in his brow. "Well, don't let the solitude get to you. Radio if you need anything." As the helicopter lifted off, I felt the familiar weight of secrecy settle back onto my shoulders. The gap between my reality and what others would accept seemed to widen with each passing day. My journals had become both refuge and burden, the only record of truths I couldn't share without risking my credibility, my position, perhaps even my sanity in others' eyes. I returned to my station and ran my fingers over the latest journal's cover, knowing its pages contained a truth that would remain mine alone as my final year at the station unfolded. Something shifted in the dynamic between me and whatever shared these mountains. The frenzied curiosity of earlier encounters gave way to what I can only describe as a measured coexistence. The activity never ceased entirely, but it settled into patterns I could almost predict. Nighttime brought the familiar sounds, heavy footfalls in the underbrush, those distinctive knocks echoing across valleys, and occasionally those low conversational murmurs that still made my skin prickle. But they maintained their distance now, rarely approaching as close as they had during those intense early encounters. Through my binoculars, I would spot crude structures on far ridges, arrangements of broken trees and branches that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. They were always just far enough away to make detailed observation impossible, yet close enough to remind me of their continued presence. The placement felt deliberate, like boundary markers. The tracks I found told a similar story. Where once they had circled close to my cabin, now they kept to the outer edges of my patrol routes, as if respecting an invisible line. I hadn't drawn this boundary, they had. It was as if they had studied me as much as I had studied them, and decided on terms of engagement that suited their needs. As my departure date approached, I felt an increasing weight of conflicted emotions. Part of me yearned for the normalcy of the world below, for conversations that didn't need to be censored, for nights without wondering what watched from the darkness. That would be the escape. But there was also a gnawing sense of betrayal in leaving. I had become part of whatever delicate balance existed here, however accidentally. These beings and I had long since accepted they were beings rather than mere animals, had allowed me into their world, if only at its edges. Walking away felt like breaking an unspoken trust. I found myself lingering longer at my observation windows, documenting every distant movement with an almost desperate thoroughness. Each knock that echoed through the valleys seemed to carry more significance now, like a language I was only beginning to grasp, but would never fully learn. I carried those journals down the mountain that final day. 10 years of observations, sketches, and experiences bound in weathered leather. They weighed heavy in my pack, not just from their physical mass, but from the truth they contained. Each page documented something that challenged what I thought I knew about these mountains, about what lives in the spaces we rarely venture. Looking back now, I don't ask anyone to believe what I witnessed. That's not the point of sharing this account. What I will say is this: there's a difference between being alone and being solitary. In all my years of ranger service, I never encountered anything that made me question my training quite like those experiences at the lookout station. The tracks that defied classification, the structures that appeared overnight, the calculated distance maintained by whatever shared that wilderness with me. These weren't the random encounters of standard wildlife behavior. Solitude has a way of stripping away our comfortable assumptions. When you spend enough time in true wilderness, away from the constant noise and distraction of civilization, you begin to notice things. The silence speaks differently. The forest's rhythms reveal patterns you missed before. And sometimes, if you stay long enough, you discover that the emptiness you perceived was never really empty at all. To those who venture into the deep backcountry, I offer this caution. Be mindful of how long you linger in those remote places. The isolation isn't what you should fear. It's the gradual realization that you're not as isolated as you thought. There are ancient eyes watching from the tree line, intelligent presences that have learned to stay just beyond our awareness. They've carved out their own territories in the spaces we've forgotten, or never fully claimed. These journals sit in my desk now, their pages filled with encounters I can barely explain. But I don't need to explain them. The wilderness holds its own truths, and some of them are better left in those high, lonely places where they belong. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story left even the smallest echo within you, consider subscribing. I'll meet you here again tomorrow with another tale that speaks softly to the soul.